Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the first panel of the festival, Decolonizing the Image, Photography as a Research Method. This panel explores projects that engage with photography as a medium and how they become a site of decolonial imagination. How it has been approached by the photographer researcher, both through archive and contemporary image making practices. Today, we curated a selection of projects from who've explored photography and its representation in the Darjeeling Himalayas, Nagaland, Arunachal Pradesh, and the high ranges of Kerala. KP Jayakumar was supposed to be here to present on his project from Kerala, but unfortunately his flight has gotten delayed and he's unfortunately not here with us. I'm going to hand over to Shuddhabrata Sengupta, writer, artist, curator with Rux Media Collective, Delhi, and also interestingly one of the first batch of arts research and documentation grantees at IFA. Over to you, Shuddhabrata, and to the panel. Welcome.
Thank you, Menika, and the India Foundation for the Arts for this wonderful opportunity to come back to Bangalore and to be with you all, and to be with this really exceptional crop of projects that I've been learning a little bit about over the last few days. And the subject that we're going to talk about is decolonizing photography. I will introduce each one of the speakers before they go on and speak. As Menika mentioned, Jayakumar is not here. He was going to be our second speaker. If he arrives by the time we are still on, then we would like to persuade him to join the panel. And otherwise, it's our loss. But just a few words about what decolonizing photography might mean before we move on. The term decolonizing entered global discourse in 1986 with a quite a remarkable book by the Kenyan writer Ngugi wa Thiong'o called Decolonizing the Mind, which tried to look at African literature through the lens of language and colonialism. And Ngugi wa Thiong'o, who was a very well-established writer and dramatist before, and wrote primarily in English, but also in the Gikuyu language of Kenya in East Africa, made an argument which said that African writers should stop writing in English. And he called this book, Decolonizing the Mind, his farewell to English as a language. And since then, he consistently wrote and conducted his practice in the Gikuyu language. Paradoxically, he was exiled from Kenya for several decades because of his political activism and had to find refuge in the United Kingdom and in the United States, where he taught, made a living by teaching and lecturing in English, while continuing to insist on the need to stop thinking and writing in English for African writers. That gives us a little bit of an idea of what the stakes are as far as the term decolonizing is concerned. It's an operation that one seeks to undertake within one's practice. It's a rejection of a history, but also an acceptance and an embrace of another set of realities and practices. It's also important to point out that in the current milieu in this country, the word decolonization has been embraced to a very large extent by the regime that rules in Delhi and its many intellectual supporters and surrogates who have been talking about decolonizing cultural and social relationships, decolonizing the law. I follow legal matters very closely, and I noticed that the Indian Penal Code, which was drafted by Macaulay in the 19th century, has now been replaced by something that's called the Bharatiya Nyaya Samhita. If you examine the provisions of the Bharatiya Nyaya Samhita, and this is of some importance to us, then there are certain offenses that are no longer present. So, for instance, the hated Section 124A, which was sedition in the Indian Penal Code, does not exist anymore. So on the face of it, this looks like a genuinely anti-colonial move until you realize that the new offenses that are being sought to be penalized within the Bharatiya Nyaya Samhita go on into the area of thought crime. They're much more stringent, much more punitive, and much more draconian than what the Indian Penal Code could have ever been. Suffice to say that decolonization is not necessarily an operation that dismantles power. It may dismantle one particular form of the operation of power, often to replace it with other forms of the operation of power. So let's say decolonizing photography now, as will be evident in the practices represented on this panel, photography was very much a part and parcel of the documentation practices and the knowledge practices of the colonial state. Surveys, anthropologists, ethnographers conducted photographic portraits or also photogrammetrical studies which measured human beings and the human bodies through anthropometry and anthropometric photographic studies. There's a remarkable Bangalore-based artist, Pushpamala, who has herself worked on these anthropometric studies to sort of displace their authority and produce a satirical, parodic, questioning practice of what to do with photography. One might even add that the idea of who we are as peoples comes to us from the physiognomies that were, for the first time, encoded through the colonial practice of photography. There's a particularly interesting set of resources called the People of India Project. People in the singular, not in the plural, by H.H. Risley, an administrator ethnographer, which sought to create photographic portraits of representatives of the people, I would say peoples of India, and sought to give a brief summary of who they are, what were their physical characteristics, what were their cultural features, how many of them were criminal tribes, how many of them were different kinds of communities, and so on and so forth. The People of India project had a Republican successor, another People of India project, and many of the photographic tableaus and portraits that constituted the colonial state's view of the Indian subject or object have been replicated in the Republican state's practices of photographic documentation, such that if you were to look at the kind of photographic studies of, let's say, the indigenous communities of this country, those that are formally called Adivasi, it would be very difficult to distinguish what would be a British colonial gaze from an Indian post-colonial state Republican gaze, which means that perhaps the decolonization process, which involved a certain transfer of power, did not adequately address the knowledge practices that were implicated in photographic portraiture or photographic documentation. And these are some of the subjects that I think which will be dealt with today. Jayakumar, who is not here, has done remarkable archival work on colonial photography as a body of practice in northern Kerala, around the tea estates of Munnar and other places. And he interestingly posits them in the return of these images within the tourist economy as a kind of gesture to what would be called a Raj nostalgia, which is an interesting phenomenon where there's a new economy around a sentimentalization of the colonial apparatus through image making, the placement of images. But that said, I would like to now introduce the panelists one by one as they speak. And so I will first call upon Dipti Tamang. This is where I come back to my notes about each of these individuals. Dipti Tamang, together with Mridu Rai, is one of the founding members of the Confluence Collective, a group of photographers active in the Darjeeling, Sikkim Himalayas. Dipti Tamang, a collaborator on this project, is a faculty member of the Department of Political Science, Darjeeling Government College. She holds a PhD from the School of International Studies, Jawaharlal Nehru University, and is interested in research on feminist security studies, gender identities, and regional movements in the Eastern Himalayas. What really intrigued me about the Confluence Collective's work, and I think that we will see examples of it in the exhibition spaces, right? So those of you who want to familiarize yourself with what Dipti and her colleagues are doing, please do take a look, and I'm sure she will introduce what the work is about, is attempts to displace the gaze. So the Sikkim, Himalayas, Darjeeling has long been a confluence of various, so confluence is about a confluence of various kinds of populations. The tea estate working force, which are often indigenous peoples from central India or other locations, people from Lower Bengal who are migrants to this area. This technically should never have been a part of Bengal. It has been forced into Bengal by a colonial measure, by the wars that the British fought with the Sikkim and the Bhutan princely states, and therefore annexed Darjeeling and some of the Duars and Kalimpong district and into West Bengal, and then subsequently the Indian state, in actually a straightforward imperial gesture, annexed Sikkim in the 1970s. So these produced many different kinds of meetings of different peoples, and I think it's interesting to think of this as an oblique archive of how to think about people, the state, land, labor, work, gender, and even, as you mentioned, a queer eye on some of these issues. So over to you, Deepti.
Very good afternoon, everyone. And thank you, Shuddhabrata, for that introduction. And thank you to IFA for inviting us to be a part of this panel today. Okay, I am Dipti, and I was supposed to be here with my collaborator Mridu, but she is not here. She's based in the UK for her PhD. So I will also be here representing the Confluence Collective and our work. To begin with, I would like to say that it's a pleasure to be here, but I'm also very anxious because it's always very, like, since we are talking about this whole idea of decolonization and all of it, it's been a few years that I've relocated back to Darjeeling, where I come from. And I think I must begin by this rote introduction of just introducing the place that Darjeeling is today a part of West Bengal. It's still very much a part of West Bengal in India. We are not from Nepal, and we are not part of the Northeast, but we are part of the Eastern periphery, belonging to the Eastern Himalayas, because this is where our stories start from. Like, we have to constantly introduce ourselves to the mainland. Like, who are we? Where are we coming from? Where do we belong to? Who are we? How are you, this person? What this is all about? So we constantly carry this baggage of our identity and our struggles with us wherever we go. So for us on the periphery, this is where our struggles begin from. And this is where our storytelling also begins from. So this discomfort is something that is sometimes very hurtful, and therefore the alienation also. So that is where I think we are all trying to relocate our work as, so that it becomes a part of our effort to be part of this whole entire gamut of knowledge production that has always, where we have always been subjects of this whole practice of knowledge production. So that is where we are located as the Confluence Collective today, and the kind of work that we are going to trying to do. We came together over these discussions. There was one exhibition that was going on, which was part of the project that we were doing with Zuban as individual people. And a bunch of us just came together. And that is when we started realizing and talking about, this need to tell our stories, to be part of this process where we are constantly reproduce knowledge on us is always reproduced off. So when IFA happened, when we applied for the grant, it was also at a very nascent stage of us coming together as a collective. So the IFA grant has been very, very important for us and has allowed us to take that, through that project, also develop questions that we wanted to address and also come together as a collective. So this project that we did with the IFA was titled Darjeeling Stories from Within. And we had 8 other people. Mridu and me, we applied for the grant, the arts research grant, and then when we got it, we gave an open call, and we had 8 other collaborators working with us, which were younger practitioners and researchers from the place, some of them with official institutional training and most of them without any kind of institutional training. So we also wanted to be that bridge. One of the major objectives of the collective is also to create that kind of a platform where those of us who've had the opportunity to have access to these places, which in itself is a very big challenge and very limited to have access to these spaces, to take that back and then also be able to become that medium where we can have these spaces curated. Like Shuddhabrata mentioned, places like ours is Darjeeling, especially if you just do a Google search or whatever, the entire knowledge on the place and its people is steeped in history of colonial practices. It's in the heart of the colonial legacy, how the place was literally produced as a sanatorium for the British, and how they then came on to create a sort of a mini Europe for themselves as part of their larger colonial project. So we have been in the heart of that colonial legacy like forever. And for us, living out there, it's not something that has come to an end. So the whole idea of decolonization also looks very different to us, feels very different for us, because we feel that it's still in a continuum. The colonial legacy is still in a continuum. So it's reflected in the tea gardens, it's reflected outside of the tea gardens, in the long history of political violence and conflict that we have now become attuned to, which has become part of our everyday lives and realities. So this project was this is an exhibition, I think it's also in the exhibition in the foyer, which will be open at 4, I was told. So this is where we are, through these mini 8 stories, where each of the grantees were looking at these multiple aspects that define the place and the people. So for instance, we have one on 1986, to begin with. That is how we curated it that way, which tells the story of how the political movement for homeland gained momentum, and it's a period which is deeply etched into the hearts and minds of people and memories back home, but which has been otherwise erased from public memory. So revisiting Chelsea through the lens is how we go back to these stories. We've visited the families and we've been curating our own smaller archives in the collective to document these narratives of trauma, of loss, of violence, and how this allows us to revert the gaze. How do we see ourselves? How do we then revisit these places? So that's one of the project. In the other project, even as I stand here today, for instance, Darjeeling has overtly been romanticized for its tea gardens. Because of this colonial legacy and obsession around the tea gardens, if you just do a Google search on Darjeeling, the first thing that will come up is the Queen of the Hills, the mountains, the mysticism, and the tea, the world-famous tea. But even as we are standing here, there is an ongoing political long relay hunger strike and workers' strike in the tea gardens right now, which has again been kept outside of the public media and scrutiny. But tea garden workers have been on strike for a very long 20-25 day period, demanding their basic right to wages, which is at 250 rupees per day today. And many tea gardens have shut down. And whenever we see these images, the first image that you see is of a woman who is smiling with the doko on her back, plucking tea gardens, which has been over and repeated through so many tropes. And that's the image that comes to our head. But when our grantees, Bibusha and Ruchi, they did one story on the tea garden workers, and they worked with the female workers, which forms a huge part. 75% of the labor workforce comes from the tea garden. So this work, the Ringtone Tea Command, it tries to go into these everyday spaces, working with women, tea garden workers, and what does it look like for them? What stories do they have to tell? And the first thing they told us was when they were like, we don't know the woman that is there on the image that we see, the smiling woman. That's not us. So there's a distinct separation between how we see ourselves and how we are seen. So life is not it's not very hard, but it is like, this is not what it is. And this whole idea, these stories are important because, for instance, it talks about our association to the land, where our questions of identity and belonging today is so centrally tied to the idea of land, especially under the current political practices and regimes where papers have become so important. For us, a huge part of our history deals with the history of migration around the tea garden, of how a settlement was created. So till date, 95% of the population, people working in the tea garden, huge part of the population and the workspace comprises of tea garden workers or cinchona plantation workers, but without access to land, but with generations of people who have been living in that land. So their whole identity comes from their association to the land. But this is at stake today because we don't have the papers, we can't prove your belonging to the land. So how does this then force us to ask deeper, bigger, meaningful questions around questions of citizenship, around belonging, around all of these things. So if the tea garden workers are today on a strike, it is not just in terms of strike for basic wages and bonuses, but also for deeper questions about what happens to us then with this connectivity that we share with the land. So these are the kind of questions which otherwise, if you see at the work that has been produced, there is immense scholarship, literature, work, artwork that is being going on, and Bollywood is filled with like stereotypes about these places. But how is it getting reproduced? What and how is it contributing to reproducing this kind of a trope? So these were very, very difficult questions for us to deal with, especially when we came together and we felt that we need to have a place, a platform where we can talk about these things. And for us, it was equally difficult because parallel to this has been the story, the reality of our places being in a place of conflict, a perpetual state of conflict and violence. So these spaces have never been established for us. For me, it's for me also personally, when I was first asked, when we were first thinking of building the collective, I was like, how do I fit in? Like, first, I am a researcher. Second, the field of arts has always been intimidating for me. Like, that's how I've always looked at arts. Like, it's always been in the high towers and like, it's always been an elite concept. Like, how do we then deconstruct it to have meaningful meanings for ourselves as well? And what kind of a dialogue are we fostering? Who are we looking towards? What is the dialogue inwards, outwards? So these were the questions that we came up with, and these were the questions that we don't still have answers to, but doing this kind of a project allowed us to move through with these difficult questions. And that's where we stand at today. Like, if we look at then giving a brief and moving into where we are as a collective today, for us, dealing with this idea of we did not have much to start off with. We just had these ideas of what we wanted to do. So it happened during the time of COVID again, where we came together, and our most immediate accessibility to us was through the family archives, family photographs. So in the past few years, as a collective, what we've been able to do is sort of build these smaller archives where we are drawing largely from family photographs, personal collections, and where a lot of individual and institutional places have come up to us. They've given us and trusted us with these collections. So we are sort of working around also looking at these archives outside of these colonized or mainstream tropes and languages, and trying to bridge this gap between how then we can look at creatively through these fissures and silences in these archives. But this is where we are at today, and I'm running short of time also, so we can have more later in the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Dipti, for that, for the confluence that your practices and that your colleagues represent. Oops. And the rich diversity that your project has so far been able to embody. And I like the fact that you ended with this note about the complexity of working with family albums and the personal memory, because every home, in that sense, is an archive, right? And given the long histories of conflict, of erasure, of silence, then these family albums perhaps also contain these fissures, and it would be a great opportunity to think with photography to displace the kind of way in which knowledge about a region has been produced. So thank you for that. We'll move from the eastern periphery to the far northeast, to Zubeni Lotha and her practice in Nagaland, which is a pleasure for me to introduce. Zubeni Lotha is a photographer from Nagaland. She has published work in Outlook Traveler, The Caravan, and has contributed to the New York Times India blog and the Random House blog. Zubeni's practice as a photographer attempts to capture flashes of tribal life in Nagaland, preserving moments from a way of life that is on the decline in the face of rapid socioeconomic changes. Her work, How Do I Look?, questions the idea of Naga culture, identity, and representation. Zubeni's ongoing project, Dimapur 797112, about her homeland of Dimapur, has been an extensive research project on looking at homeland, looking at home, and looking at how one relates to land and space. Zubeni Lotha attempts to study and understand the construction of identity and representation of the Konyak Nagas by looking specifically at the photographs taken by the Austrian ethnologist Christoph von Führer-Heimendorf in 1936 and later. I know you said that your project has moved significantly from this initial conception, but I think it's an interesting peg to start with because Führer-Heimendorf and many other anthropologists actually contributed to the mosaic identity that we now know as Naga. As anyone who has studied the history of this region knows, the word Naga as a placeholder actually is an attempt to put together many diverse communities. The Konyaks, the Angami, the Ao, the Lotas, and other communities who don't even share necessarily a language, because like linguists have, like Peggy Mohan, for instance, have written extensively about Nagamese as a modern 19th, 20th century language, which takes a lot from other languages, including Hindi, Bengali, Assamese, to construct a kind of lingua franca by which different people from different communities can communicate both with each other and the outside world. So the construction of the term Naga is not that different from the construction of the term Indian. And the continuing construction of the term Naga and the continuing construction of the term Indian have to do with our ability to recognize certain features as being noticeably Indian. And our ability to recognize these as Indian is something that dates to the colonial period. There was no person called Indian before the British Empire established itself in India. And I think that's an important way to think about the fact that perhaps we get also imprisoned by these identities and somewhat confined by these identities, and decolonial practice would mean opening up some of these spaces to see the distance between the photographic construction of life and life itself, and see how else we might imagine ourselves. Over to you. You want to speak?
Yeah, I'll just speak. Hello, everybody. Thank you, Shuddha, for the introduction. Thank you, IFA, for this invitation to come and be on this platform. And thank you, everyone, for joining us. My name is Zubeni. I've been introduced, so I'm not going to go into that. My work, the proposal that was funded by IFA was, as Shuddha mentioned, looking at Heimendorf's photographs of the Nagas, because this happened to be the first, not the first, but I would say the first of its kind anthropological study on the Nagas, which was very formal, because it was for his PhD thesis, so it came out in the form of a book, which became very, it influenced a lot of the future anthropologists that came to study the Nagas. And I think the Nagas are also one of the most studied people that way in India. So I really wanted to look at these images because even till today, these images are reproduced, and as Nagas, I think most of you might be familiar, especially with the Hornbill festivals.
it's almost the same images as Heimendorf had photographed. They were very much constructed, posed. It was interesting to do this the work because I had to go through most of his photographs and look at a lot of his tour diaries, which is available. It's a public on the public forum. So that really gave me an insight into the way he took these images, and I know a lot of them were constructed because that's how he's written it in his tour diaries, because he kept an extensive diary of his travels, and he lived in the Cognac region for 1 year trying to learn the language. He was, he really got into that whole environment. But I think he also very much romanticized the place, and his images and the photographs that he took really reflected that. And I know I really wanted to deconstruct or to kind of break those images down. So I'll just show an example of the work that I did. But like Shuddha said, I kind of look at it very differently now. Okay, so this is an image. This is just, you go to these places, it's mountainous regions. These are like, even for me, it is quite rural when I travel to these places. But this is the place that, these are the regions that Heimendorf actually stayed in. And this is the natural forest, the natural vegetation that you would find there. It is always misty, covered in mist. It's either raining, and so this is the environment that people live in. And this is the image that I took. So my struggle was, how do I deconstruct, or how do I how do I make an image that is so away from the images that are produced of the Nagas or of that region. So that became a huge struggle and a huge problem for me. But I know that when people talk about the Nagas or Nagaland, it's always very conflict related, especially what is in the mainland news items. It's always about conflict. It's always about something to do with the struggle, the Naga struggle. And the most I wouldn't say famous, but what is most known about the Nagas is that they were headhunters. So that's always been a fascination, I think, for anthropologists, people who come there, that story of the headhunters. But the headhunters is just not something that is, outside, it's not something that's separate. It is very much part of the environment that they were living in. It's very much part of the social, economic, or the worldview that they had. So it also has a history that is connected to so many other things. And that is something that I really wanted to look at and kind of, show through images. And this particular tree is actually a head hunting. It's a tree that used to hang heads. So these trees were found in almost all villages, and they would head human heads, skulls, in these trees. They would hang them when they would come back from the enemy, the warfare, and if they got heads, they would hang in these trees. And these trees still exist. Of course, it's just become part of the village. It's part of the village history now. People don't practice, obviously, the practices, but the tree is still there, which means there's a history behind a tree that's standing there for so many years. And so I wanted to take an image of this, and this was taken, and I had to really think about how do my idea was also not to make it fantastic. It's not to, once again, romanticize this idea of, this place, but how do you take images of something like this? Let's say a tree that has a history, which is not written, but it's an oral history. And my method, I would like to speak a little bit on the method. I just kind of went there at night. It's very nice because in the village there hardly any electricity, so it's really dark. And I just kind of opened my camera and I kept it on for like 10 minutes. So I really just, so it's, in my mind, it was kind of just absorbing all the history that this tree had gone through over the years. It's almost 100-year-old tree, I'm told, by the villagers. So, that was one way of taking so this was how I was kind of trying to get away from the image that Heimendorf had produced and created, and it's become so influential today. I'm really not going to show his images, because if you haven't seen it, you can imagine what it could be like. Warriors, half-clothed women, exotic. You can just imagine what it would be like. But I will leave you with these images, which are what I found in my journey. So this was found in a very old village gate, and they must have done this, an idea of what a Naga man would be. So this is coming from the people themselves. They've kind of created this image of themselves. They're producing their own art in a way. This other image is what they think. This is also it's a very common practice actually in the Konyak region. They do a lot of wood carving art. And if you look at all the images here, it's about the trees, it's about the animals that they know about. There's a picture of the Christ, because many of them are Christians today, so that's what they believe in. So it's their social life, it's their cultural life, the social life. It's what they know, and that's what they're producing it. That's what they have produced, and these are the images that I wanted to kind of photograph and show as a representation of the life that people inhabit there. So that was part of the proposal, the part of the work. But now today I look at it very differently, because I'm sitting here and I'm thinking, like, how do you decolonize photographs when you go back time and again to these villages? When I'm an outsider when I go to these villages. I need an interpreter. I need a guide. I need to ask permission. I have to go through this entire process. It's just because I'm a Naga doesn't mean I have access to them so easily. And so I'm as much as an outsider as the colonials were, I suppose. And so I'm thinking, am I doing the same thing? Am I once again taking these images and colonizing them through these images? I think for me the most important thing is, I'm not a researcher, so I don't have, I don't know the methodology of research and all of that, but when I take photographs, when I go to these villages, or when I meet people, when I speak with them, the most important thing that I've found is to be very honest about the work, because I don't think we can escape this dilemma, or this, that we always have, this ethical question of, is it right what I'm doing, is it wrong what I'm doing? This can never be solved, I feel. But I think as long as me as a practitioner is honest about what I'm doing, how I'm doing, I think that would make, I think that makes more sense to me. I think intentions are very important, because my work is, I have been a co-curator with the Humboldt Forum in Berlin. They wanted to put up an exhibition on the Nagas. So we kind of, the exhibition is still going on. But what I found in my work there was that, they have all these collections there. They have taken all these Naga objects. The material culture is really rich there. It's there. They have it. We as Nagas have to go and look at it and say, oh my goodness, I've never seen this in my life. It's like I have to go to another country to really get to know my ancestry, or my history, or whatever, through these objects. But what I've realized in the course of that work is that for the collectors, and we have gone through their diaries, we've gone through their labels, many of them were mislabeled also. That's one problem. The other thing is, you're never sure what they're thinking. You never know what their intentions are, because it's never there. They've never explained themselves. What are you doing with these collections? Why do you come and collect these things? But they want me, as a Naga, to sit there and explain exactly why I'm doing what I'm doing. So this is something that I find extremely problematic. And I'm sitting here and I'm doing the same thing here. And today I still feel I'm being colonized because Nagaland, as you know, Nagas, we're still, we finished with the British colonials left once the Indian independence, but we were immediately colonized by the armed forces. And I still feel that this decolonization is not happening. It's a very different experience for us. Because as Dipti says, we are from a very we have a history of conflict. But we don't have to look at it that way. When we take photographs, when we tell our stories, it doesn't always have to be about that because we live a much larger life. We have a life that is beyond all of that. But we tend to focus on that so much because it's a very sexy story. The other stories are not. And that is the tragedy of this, I feel. And that's all I have to say. Thank you.
Thank you, Dipti, for a very layered presentation about what it means. Zubeni. Thank you, Zubeni. Amnesia is a colonial problem. For that very layered presentation. And I think what you point out is this question of what does it mean to be an insider and outsider. And I think taking that theme forward, I would request Sharbendu to talk about being the insider-outsider that he is.
Thank you, Shuddha, for introducing me. Thank you, Menaka, Harshita, and the entire IFA team for having me over here. It's a very tricky subject, like Dipti and Zubeni have tried to emphasize. Decolonizing the image. Where do we manage it from? How do we do it? How do we go about this whole process? To begin the process of decolonization, do we look at the history? I thought of bringing in some keywords, quick snapshots, just to drop in these words to stimulate a conversation later on. So what has this colonial gaze been about? Racial dominance based on a flawed sense of superiority. And here, let's not forget about internal colonialism. They perceived and portrayed us as primitives. Even here, as I use the word they, I don't feel comfortable with it because the word they very conveniently and very innocently, in a seemingly innocent manner, starts to categorize others and people. Extractivism established hegemony over people and resources across the world. It systematically separated man from nature and animals. And it is here that illustrations and photographs became one of the primary tools of recording or making a record of the likeness of someone. Eventually, all of this together, starting with a certain idea, is the Cartesian dualism. They exoticized us as specimens for study, something that Shuddha very appropriately explained it for us. He talked about the People of India series. This is a particular photograph from that series. After the 1857 mutiny, the Governor General of India, at that time, Lord Canning, he conceived this photographic study. Watson and Kay, under them, they came up with this 8-volume, The People of India series. When I was a student of photography at Westminster in London many years ago, we were introduced to this book, and at that time, there was no critique. We were just told, okay, look at this work. And I think they were particularly looking at me and another classmate of mine. We both were Indians. And at that time, I did not have the lens to critically understand or even fathom, is this problematic? Do I admire this? But as an individual who wanted to be a photographer, been to the West, and was trying to learn, I looked at it as a reference point. Oh, the People of India series, okay, let's look at it. Over the period of time, many of us have repeated the same problematic imagery. This established the standard approach to photographing indigenous communities and the subaltern on the basis of race, caste, and tribe. I just thought of bringing two cover images from Heimendorf's books. This is precisely what Zubeni was trying to avoid. I'm sorry, Zubeni. But there was, I think, this was also done at a point in time where the world was split into many millions of mini islands. People were not as connected, so the desire to know what's happening and understand other communities. Of course, there was a certain prejudice sense also implicit in it. But how do we break away from it? Many photography colleagues of mine and friends and many of our predecessors, and I'm not saying this as particularly in the spirit of pointing finger, but more in the spirit that we need to acknowledge what has been happening in parts. We've been aping their styles. We've been aping what we've been taught. And photography as an invention from the West, we have been copying them, we have been looking up to them. I found this quote to be very interesting, and it says a lot. The soul of a fish is in danger when it aspires to become a bird. But then how do we not do that? How does a fish become a fish? How does a fish realize that I'm a fish? Or I have a certain uniqueness in the form and spirit of being a fish? Is the lone tendency to counter, to reject the past, to resist enough, or even appropriate? A certain postmodern tendency has been the act and art of rejection purely. What about internal colonialism? How do we wade through these domestic minefields? How do we counter otherization? Is decolonization also about reimagining different possibilities within the domain of the visual culture, particularly photographic? And how do we build better? Here, I do not propose any solutions, for I don't have any, but through my own practice, and I'll try to show you a certain body of work that I worked on with the IFA grant, I've come to believe that photography in itself is nothing. In 2022, I was in New York on a visiting artist fellowship at the Harvard, and I had the chance to meet Dwayne Michaels. I always looked up to him. And so I wrote to him, and he replied, inviting me for coffee one afternoon, and I spent a whole long afternoon. Dwayne is in his 90s, and he said over our conversations, photography will always be a minor art as long as it is about observation. So then what do we do if not observe? Are there other ways? I thought of bringing in this example, and from here, let's do a quick exercise, and I'd like to have responses from you as well. Tell me what you see. And I'm going to show you a trailer from The Life of Pi.
Tell me what you see.
Sorry about that. Has everyone seen the film Life of Pi? A quick hands up? Okay, quite a few. So I'm not going to explain, but just to establish the context, basically Pisin Patel and his family with their zoo animals get on the ship. There's a shipwreck and a whole journey. He loses his entire family and he manages to get himself into a boat with a tiger, a zebra, and an orangutan probably. And tell me what you see. There are two ways. At the end, the insurance agents come, they don't believe in his fantastical story, and they say, give us something that we can believe. This is too odd, you're cooking it up. And so he gives a documentary story. Oh, this happened, and my mother died, my father died, the shipwreck, and then somehow I managed to survive, and that was satisfactory. And that's the irony of how the world does not like to see certain things in a way that does not fit in with their way of seeing, with their sense of perception, as if we have to play to the gallery all the time, as if we have to sing a song the way you like it all the time. And I'm not saying this with an insult, I'm not offending anybody. But here is the ending scene, and I have always found it very moving. Volume up.
I've told you two stories about what happened out on the ocean. Neither explains what caused the sinking of the ship. And no one can prove which story is true and which is not. In both stories, the ship sinks, my family dies, and I suffer. True. So which story do you prefer?
The one with the tiger. That's the better story.
Thank you. And so it goes with God.
And so let's establish that there can be different ways of seeing, there can be different ways of showing, there should be different ways of showing, rather than sticking to one linear approach of the document. Okay, what do you see? What's going on here? Any quick responses? What do you think is going on here? Louder, please. Racing. Okay, racing. Adventure. A sense of freedom. Exploration. Azad khayalat. Going with the wind. All right, okay. What do you see? Okay, much boring. Majburi? Okay, majburi. Kyun majburi? Okay, so here is a man we see probably काम करने के लिए जा रहा है, doesn't look very excited. Cycle का shape is not the Mach 1 like an adventure. Background में you see the smog of our Sada Delhi. तो मज़ा नहीं है अब. But it's the same road, it's the same cycle, it's a person. What changed? What do you see? Okay. Sorry, a little louder. Dreamlike situation. Okay. Why? It's the same, right? It's a person with a bicycle on a road. Okay, so every day we see someone bicycling in a river. No, every day is for them, not for. So, okay. Then are we saying that they bike in the river? Could be, yes. Okay. It would be nice to try doing that against the tide. But the point I'm trying to make here is that are there different ways of seeing? Can we see things differently? Can we show things differently? The same thing. Stories are metaphors in search of a context, waiting to be told and given new relevance. And in sync with the contemporary times, the shifting of sensibilities and the politics and tastes of our audiences and us all, do we need to re-examine these? Now I'm quickly going to show you some images from my series Imagined Homeland. This was supported by an art research grant from IFA and a grant from the Lucy Foundation. Uh, the community that I've worked with here lives on that red dot in Arunachal Pradesh, the indigenous Lisu community. They live on the Indio-Myanmar border. I'm not going to go in depth about their cultural, social, and political problems right now. But just to give a context, they live in a far-fetched area in the middle of a forest. And there's a lot of historical, political problems of what the government did, why they live like that and stuff. But to offer you a lens, yes, this is a story of deprivation, disenfranchisement of them as citizens of the country. There's poverty, there's suffering, and all of that. When I went in there, I worked on this for 7 years. With the initial set of images, when I came back to Delhi and I showed it to my colleagues and editors, and they said, हाँ हमने देखा हुआ है ऐसी कहानियाँ. It's about poverty, it's about a tribe, गरीबी है, struggle है, da da da. But they were not being able to, or I was not being able to show. And so I started to think, is this way of trying to show with the documentary sensibility, is it working? And people were classifying them, the gatekeepers were classifying them into the documentary realism, into that category. So I started to wonder, is there another way? Can I find other ways? And I kept on probing. Professor James Scott, who recently passed away, in his seminal scholarship, The Art of Not Being Governed, he offers us a certain lens through the definition of Zomia. Zo basically means a remote area, and me are the people who live in these remote areas. And when we look at people or communities who live in far-flung remote areas, is it just about misery, poverty, hardship? Yes, that's very much there. I'm not saying it's not there. But he also says Zomia are the people who have fled the valleys to escape state oppression, corvée labor, unfair taxation, the highlands in favor of freedom and preservation of their way of life. This is another possibility. This is a story of Malidiu, who was a school teacher, and for the 2 months that I lived in his village, Shidikha, in 2018, I've been there in 2016, 2013, and later on for 4 months in 2019. He would come and hang out with me in the afternoon after his school, and he said he doesn't want to be a farmer. He doesn't want to be a school teacher because it's the same rigmarole of life and it's not very exciting. So he's looking for a new way. Using conceptual photographic approaches, I started to wonder, is there another way of showing or evoking a sense that here is him and many of us who are on a journey trying to find that elusive light of symbolically our dreams and aspirations, whatever we want to be. Children explore the mythical forest. The swan or members from the duck family keep recurring in my representation. 3 teacups, father and the child. I constantly use the water body, the streams and river as a symbolic element. In dream symbolism, it is said that when you see yourself dreaming of crossing a water body, or either in a ship or in using whichever way, it is often a sign of an impending change about to come in your life. So I started to bring in these psychological references into the work. So they're sitting in the middle of a little stream, but the operative word here is the relationship between the father and the child, but also there are 2 people, but there are 3 teacups, and the title 3 teacups, father and the child, is meant to allude towards that 3rd teacup. Who is it for? Was somebody here and is not here now? Or is it that they are waiting for someone? So it's that wait, and at the same time, it's their relationship. As a father and daughter, the parental relationship continues. It doesn't stop. The definition of family doesn't stop there. Waiting in the forest. So here is the father with his children. The mother figure is absent. They're watching a television. They're accompanied by 2 ducks. There's a recent book that's coming out and day after tomorrow, there's a panel about this by the editors, Shilpi Goswami and Surya Nandini Narayan. Urvashi Butalia will be part of that. It's being published by Zuban, framing portraits, binding albums. And in this, Ranu Roy Chaudhuri writes an essay on the making of Imagined Homeland. And with reference to the previous image, she writes, seated on wooden benches, an adult man and 3 children stare at the television set, accompanied by a flower vase. both placed on a table covered in a patterned fabric, and the human faces are illuminated by the screen's neon hue. This description can fit a whole range of family snapshots encoding forms of 20th century leisure from across spaces. The reader is transported immediately to a stereotypical modern urban home, embodying a sense of comfort. However, waiting in the forest includes two ducks next to the seated man and unfolds in a dense tropical rainforest illuminated by artificial light. Given the limited solar-powered electricity and wireless network in Lisu villages, the television set signals its limited function, mimicking the limit set by the forest to access modern goods and services. Simultaneously, it signifies the Lisu desire for connectivity with the world beyond their immediate surrounding. Some of these motifs are shared by Untitled, including the little boy glued to the television, the flower vase, and the pony. Additionally, Figure 4 has an Airtel dish antenna, a set-top box, and a plate of white rice. Unlike Waiting in the Forest, the story in Untitled unfolds in a paddy field in what appears to be a valley. In the middle of a stream, and I'm constantly trying to tell the same story about them waiting, their vulnerability, their longingness, and there I was referencing their folklores and journalistic historical accounts. There's an incident that had happened before this image was made in 2019. It's a bit of a mystical, quite a strange, but due to the lack of time, I'm not going to get into that in detail, but we can talk about it later on. They believe in a certain concept of mamim, which is of an invisible portal that exists in the same time-space continuum. And anyway, we can talk about that later on. And that kind of influenced the making of Eliza at the gate. What gate are we talking about? Dream language, symbolism has so much psychic energy that we are forced to pay attention to it. And here I was also looking at archetypes, trying to build an understanding of it. This is a mother and her son. They're sitting in their pineapple garden, probably doing nothing. So what's going on over here? Do we always sensationalize? Is it an activity that has to happen? Can it not be just simple domestic stuff that unfolds? This is David Yobin and his duck waits. Okay, I'm going to quickly jump forward. That's Exodus 1 and Exodus 2. I'll quickly show the making of Exodus 1 and 2. Audio, please.
सर बैग इधर में रख देगा
भीज जाएगा अभी रख दो
अभी
अभी के लिए हाँ
तो उधर में बिगड़
हाँ 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 अभी के लिए ठीक से सेफली रख दो और जाके तिरपाल लाओ साथ में जानवर भी लाना है और सिसायु का ट्रंक भी लाना है तो दीदी का साथ बात करके जो लाना है एक बार में हो सके तो लेके आए एक जन जबड़ा का इंतजाम करें And so we are setting things up slowly, and one has to move very slowly in this process. You make one wrong step and you can lead to a fatal accident. And there is no rescuing you from there. It takes about 3 days, depending on the location, 3 days by foot, crossing the river and through treks that you have to come, and people are often taken on stretchers. If दुनिया में जाए जहाँ पे लाइफ का लोग एक जर्नी में है कि कहीं जाता है, फिजिकली नहीं जा रहा है, लेकिन आपका मन में तो ख्वाहिश है कि एक बेटर लाइफ होना। तो वो चीज़ को कि यहाँ से सिंबॉलिकली फोटो में कैसे दिखाएगा आपका मन में कैसा है, फोटो में तो नहीं दिखा सकता मन का बात, कैमरा के अंदर तो नहीं दिखेगा, तो सिंबॉलिकली दिखा रहा है कि ऐसे लेके आप लोग कोई जगह जा रहे हैं, ये सब आपके साथ, ये प्रोसेस जल्दी नहीं होता है। अच्छा, ये स्प्रे को इधर रखने से conversations that happen. So I'm just going to conclude with now it's also talking about decolonization, and we artists and photographers by ourselves can't do much. Our own power and is limited. We can make certain works, but if there are art historians and other scholars who don't write about, who don't engage with us, then the outreach of our work gets limited. Just some of the last line from Ranu's essay. The space he creates is not entirely premised on any pre-existing cultural narrative at the myth. Instead, Day resorts to his imagination in interpreting the word mythical as he documents Lisu way of life, philosophy, and magnanimity of spirit. It makes him realize that they epitomize the true essence of being magical. Inspired by the Lisu folk traditions and oral narratives, he devises a form of magical realism towards his twin impulse to address, on the one hand, a specific history of visualizing Indian tribes, and on the other hand, imagination as an operative category to address borderland tribal identity. Without any claim to realism or semiotic fidelity to material realities, Imagine Homeland creates photographic realities that can accommodate competing notions of a historically specific borderland tribe and an ahistorical representation of their belongingness to the geography they inhabit. It muddles dominant understandings of home, family, domesticity, and citizenship by weaving a layered narrative of how human and non human subjects coexist in seemingly contradictory worlds of everyday modern objects and supposedly ahistorical wilderness of a tropical rainforest where politics collide with fantasy. With its visual economy and complex narrative, the genre-bending Imagine Homeland pushes the limits of easy categorization and encourages looking beyond the critical lenses available within photographic discourses. Now, me reading this out is not with the objective of tom-tomming my work. It's just another experiment and attempt, and there are many of us who are trying. I just wish to end with one line from the same essay. I was invited to write an essay in response to the essay critiquing Imagine Homeland. So this is an excerpt from the essay that I've written in the book, and this is the question I would like to leave all of us with. If a contemporary history has to be written, especially about communities that have gone largely underrepresented, misrepresented, or unrepresented, do we artists and historians bear the responsibility of devising new strategies to aid reimagination so as to correct historical wrongs that risk becoming staple narratives? Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sharbendu, for a really, really rich presentation that where I see at the collision of politics and fantasy, where the urge to imagine and to reimagine is at the crux of asking the question of who might we yet be? That the question of who we are is not something that's frozen in time. A photograph freezes a moment in time, but can we take photographic practice to unfreeze that moment and to set it on a different journey? I think the question of decolonization in photography is really poised on this problem. Thank you, both of you, Dipti and Zubeni, and also Sharbendu, for an excellent panel, which has brought up lots of interesting questions. I'm sure people in the audience have some. I'm going to hold mine in reserve until the audience has had its satisfaction. And then I will come back at the end to all three of you. Would anyone like to start?
Thank you. These were very inspiring presentations. I somehow felt that through the three conversations, we were moving to perhaps a much bigger critique about photography itself as a tool that's incomplete and limiting. So I think especially in Zubeni's conversation, when you said that they don't tell what you feel, they don't tell the story, and that incompleteness of the tool itself becomes perhaps a bait to the colonizing or the colonized view or the gaze, is something that we didn't speak about. And if all of you would want to share some thoughts on what more could happen to photography for who feel colonized.
That's a wonderful question. Could you please introduce yourself as well?
I'm Ishita Shah. I'm a curator. I build culture preservation projects through a collective called Curating for Culture.
Yeah, this is a very difficult question because it's a dilemma in my head all the time. And I don't have any answers to that, but in my own practice, in my own work, initially when I first started, as a student, you're just coming out and you start taking photographs. You have this imagination of how it should be done and, all of that. But when you start taking photographs and you start engaging with the people and you meet people and all, then you realize actually, I just made this. Then you realize you're really actually just kind of really intruding into their lives, especially when you take, because I love taking portraits of people. And I find it very intrusive. But at the same time, that's something that really excites me. So we have this, so it's always a dilemma in my head. So now what I've done is, I've really tried to be very honest with myself and the subject, obviously the people that I'm photographing. And in one or two photographs, I've kind of let myself be in the image itself also. So I don't know if that kind of answers your question, but this is something that is still like a big ethical question for me as well. So I hope we all come, somebody would be able to come up with a better answer.
To be very honest, I'm on the same plane as Zubeni, but we were having this conversation also in the morning, and while it is this sense of recognition, especially as someone belonging to a community, not just me, but other people also who belong to minority communities whose voices have never been on these places, this realization itself also comes as being very limiting and overwhelming to us as practitioners from the place itself, So it's like, it's a very difficult question, and we are constantly dealing with this idea of like ethics around our practices in the place also. So like Zubeni said, I think for us, I would like to use an us here because I feel like I'm representing a place and people. To have this dialogue from the periphery is to begin with this acknowledgement that, honesty, a very, very honest premise of like, what is going to happen with this work? Because when we go back and we work as insiders in the place, we are often asked, like, we are told, like, people come do research on us, go away. People come do this and go away. We don't even know what happens to that after that. We really don't know what's happening. So that leaves another set of undoing for us then to start from there. So I think just this premise of at least being honest, and if it's a collaboration, at least also taking it as a collaboration, making these smaller changes and effort goes a very long way in establishing this new alternative place that we are talking about. Because it has to be a collaborative practice. The dialogue has to begin because it will be uncomfortable, but that discomfort has to be felt. I think that's where we are at.
So just to recap, your question was about the limitation of the camera or photography as a tool. Every medium has its own limitations. Now, this is something as a photographic artist and for photographers, we need to understand the strengths and limitations of that specific medium. Photography with the still medium has certain advantages over cinema. Cinema as a medium has certain advantages over the still photograph because of continuum. There's more that can be brought in within the frame, and yet it's so fleeting that very few of them register. A photograph brings that strength, it's static, it stays there, it looks at you, it makes you uncomfortable as long as you can dare to sit in front of it. So, the first part, I believe, is we need to examine the strength and limitations of the medium. We make peace with it, we understand it, and we work with that. For example, let's say घर बना रहे हैं. घर का एक दरवाज़ा बनेगा. दरवाज़ा बनाने के लिए we need some tools. हथौड़ा चाहिए, nail चाहिए, and then रंदा मारने वाला, the different tools we need. ठीक है? Do we focus on the tool? मेरा हथौड़ा कैसा है, ये बड़ा है, ये छोटा है, ये मोटा है, ये भारी है. Initially. And beyond that, we focus on the door, on the wood, the aesthetics of the wood, what kind of wood it is. जब moisture ज़्यादा होता है तो wood कैसे respond करता है. So what is the focus on? The focus for long has been on the tool. We today are already in a post-medium era. So can we shift the focus beyond the medium? It's on the story. And the limitation of the tool is for the practitioners to sort it out.
I just want to disagree and I'll leave it at that because I don't want to own too much of space, but I was coming from the point of view of content because all these images come to us as archives and we see the days continue. So I don't think I was talking from the tools perspective. I also don't agree that the tools are limited to the ones who know how to use the tools. The one who works with the content also might have questions.
Everybody has questions and they're valid, and I'm not trying to say that...
the content and the tool are hand in hand, is all I'm trying to say.
Absolutely. And I'm here, I'm not trying to isolate the two. I thought that you were talking about the tool and its limitations, so I took that technical aspect first. The second aspect of it is definitely the content. And everybody understands photography is not a rocket science, it's rather a fairly simple one. So there's no rocket science around it. And everybody gets a certain sense of it. What I'm trying to say is that once we acknowledge that, and what can be done with it? And that's where ethics come in place. That's where how do we tell stories? What are the sensibilities? What are the different ways in which we can maneuver through it? That's what comes into place.
Sorry, I just have to add something to this. Yeah, I mean, I understand Sharbendu's point of view, but I felt a little incomplete in saying this. As a practitioner, we come with our own biases and judgments and prejudices. So that definitely also intrudes into the work that we produce. So I think there is limitation on every ground. I think even technically there is limitation. You know, so I just wanted to add that.
Okay.
Could we throw any media? Why should we single out only photography?
No, no, because we are
Yeah, but I mean it's general.
it's general.
Even as a writer, like for now, I'm so sorry, but like as a researcher, when I go back and I'm writing is my primary medium. I feel that what you're talking about, like, you know, I feel what Zubeni was talking about, like I feel like an intruder in the spaces because we've been trained when we went into these institutions, we went from these places into these institutions, then we were trained to particularly operate with certain methodologies and practices and all of that. We ingrain that practice. So we think like going there is like, this is the field, I am the researcher, I'm here, I'm objective, I'm subject, like, you know, there's a certain neutrality to it. But it's not. Like over these many years of practices, I've realized that it's not. Like it can't be this simple. Also in terms of like just recognizing and realizing, it doesn't stop at that. Like it still continues in terms of what we are producing as a story also, because located within these positions, then when you're producing these stories, there is an added burden of, are we reproducing the same narrative? Are we part of these same structures? Are we actually decolonizing? Like, you know, that is a very, very difficult questions to navigate. So we're limited in terms of these things.
And also who consumes, how it's consumed.
I know there are other questions, so thank you, Ishita, for that marvelous provocation. Yes. Yes. Yes, sir.
Thank you.
Please introduce yourself.
Yes, Hemachandran. Somewhat chipping in with the same kind of question. I teach writing. I'm a teacher of literature. So one of the things I do with my students is to think about unlearning. One of the points of unlearning, we think collectively in our classroom, is an old bad habit. That is, when you write English, you have to write it without Hindi, Tamil, or Telugu, any mother tongue interference, or old grammarians' English. So get rid of that old training. I like my students and me to unlearn that strict grammarians writer toolbox. My parallel question is this to photographers here. When you hold a camera in front of you, wherever you take it with you, does it help you rehabilitate or unlearn bad habits of seeing, no matter where you take it? If so, I would like to learn about it. Thank you.
Bad habits of seeing. We could spend a whole lifetime talking about that one, but I'm going to ask each of you to respond. All right.
Okay, as a photographer, the first thing I had to unlearn was to stick with the rules of thirds. I really had to unlearn that. I realized that that was put in place for a specific purpose by specific people in a specific region. Because I started seeing images which were not only produced in the West, but from our region, East and everything. You know, it's also the sunset is very different. The way the sun rises and sets and the way it stays in the horizon is very different, at least from the way it is in my place. I don't get that perfect sunset. It's the way, it's the geographical location. I've kind of figured that out. And so I just said, chuck with the rule of thirds. It really doesn't apply to me. When I go to the field, I cannot be waiting for that golden hour. I can't. You know, there's sometimes I just have to take a photograph. So that's how I've kind of learned how to unlearn the training that's been given to me to take photographs. So those are some of the few technical things that I've incorporated in my practice. And sometimes it works. I mean, you know, a lot of times I know there are some people who look at my work and say, hey, the composition is a little off. I'm like, yeah, that's okay. It doesn't matter, because at that point, I really wasn't thinking about composition. I just had to take the image. So yeah, those are the things that I've learned.
Sharbendu.
I mean, this is a seriously tricky question. I'm trying to think of an answer, realize that it's all right to come across as a fool or across as someone who doesn't know the answer. But how do we unlearn? In my practice, earlier I used to move around with the camera all the time. Now I don't. When I'm also in a community, there is a certain strange impulse within a photographer to capture, quote unquote, a moment as we've been taught or trained. Over the years now, what I have done is I don't move around with the camera many a times. The camera is in my bag, but I don't take it out. Or I've left it in the room, in the village or wherever I'm staying. And I'm spending time talking to them, socializing, or just going to the river, playing with the children, or doing something. And these are not with an agenda all the time. At the end of it, I'll get an image. But I'm trying to understand. So there are things that they are saying, they're informing, and it takes a lot of time for that information to translate into an emotion within me in an organic way. So I have to give myself that time if I'm not very brilliant or sharp in quickly translating something. So that time is very important. Like in the making of Imagine Homeland, here for the paucity of time, I did not show the set of documentary images. But I began with taking documentary photograph, which was training. I've applied the rules. Slowly later on, I just started to spend time with them. And then I would also withdraw because I can't always socialize with the community because they're always telling something. And in those moments when I would be alone without anyone, I would sit and write my notes, what had been said, how it has been said, what do they expect, etc., etc. And then I would wait for a certain response. Many a times, it is also the process of unlearning is also the need and ability to listen and to wait. For the making of Imagine Homeland, for example, and that's just to illustrate, I did wait a lot, not by design, not consciously that I'm going to wait and it will come, but it just happened organically. And many a times I had dreams and I would get up at 2 in the night and I would switch on my torchlight, there's no electricity, and I'm writing down a scene because I've seen a dream. Sitting here and talking about that, oh, I saw a dream, it sounds a bit too, again, trying to romanticize one's own work, but there are these things that have happened. So I think there are also these ways of unlearning. Just listen, see, observe, and then your brain conjures up imagery after a point in time, especially if we are working with the conceptual approaches, which does offer a certain degree of liberty also. I don't know if that answers, but...
I'm grateful for that answer.
Thank you. There's a young man up front who seemed very agitated and animated while Zubeni was speaking. I'm sure you have a question.
I was still framing my question, but it's framed already in my mind. I was writing it down. So, okay, so since we are looking at photography as a research method, I noticed that there are 3 points of views. One is the researcher's eye. Second is the researcher's lens or the camera. The third is the methodology, which is debated. The aesthetic that the researcher has known, the training, versus the aesthetic that the photographed, it debates with the aesthetic that the researcher has known. So earlier somebody asked about, somebody talked about unlearning wrong ways of seeing. But, and I think Ishita also talked about the method, the tool. And there was a debate where we are trying to shift the focus from the method to the story. But if we are to bring out the story through photography, then shouldn't we also have a significant focus on the methodology, on the tool, which is not just the lens, not just the training, but also the aesthetic? I don't know if my question is clear enough. Okay.
Anybody wants to get onto that? I might take a stab. I think, and this comes back to a question that the lady had interjected, a comment. What makes photography special? I think the problem and the opportunity with photography arose when photography as a medium is the first amongst the arts to index reality. A landscape painter paints a picture of what he sees, but that is a process that goes through him, through his imagination, and onto the canvas. The photograph is a double-edged thing because ultimately it's also the action of light on the picture plane, within the camera apparatus, or the digital image-making process, right? So while there is the eye of the person who's taking the photograph, there is also the conditions of light, for instance, as you said, the weather, what is in front of you, that's part of the objective reality. And we are living today at this moment at a time when the majority of photographs are actually not taken by human beings anymore, right? So, and as we move more and more into the future, the amount of photographs, although the amount of photographs taken by human beings has increased enormously because all our phones are cameras, not all our cameras are phones. But the number of images that are taken by satellites in the sky, surveillance cameras in the city, medical equipment, and all sorts of other forms of unconscious, unintentional photography. There may be an intention at a very broad level, but it's very difficult to say who is the person behind the camera. And that brings back a focus on the apparatus and on the tool. It was very interesting to hear this discussion between Ishita and Sharbendu, where Sharbendu talked about hammers and nails. There is one philosopher called Heidegger whose entire thesis on technology is all about a hammer, right? But he says the hammer can't do anything by itself. It's the force of the arm on the hammer, with which the arm wields the hammer, that affects the nail. But we're now moving to a different dimension. The hammer may not require the arm right now. So we're moving to a situation, and this will also be an aesthetic, because aesthetics is not about questions of beauty and ugliness. Aesthetics, I always say this whenever I start teaching, you know, what is the word that is the opposite of aesthetics? Anesthesia.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense.
Right? Anesthesia, anesthetics is what you are given in order to numb your sensations. So aesthetics produces a certain sharpening of your sensory field. And that changes the way we think about the agency of who takes a photograph or who doesn't. For instance, if I could ask Zubeni the question, if Christoph von Führer-Heimendorff were to magically appear right now, what would you say to him?
To take those photographs in the first place, you know?
Yeah, okay. What?
Why did he take it the way he took it?
Why did he take them the way he took it? Which is what returns us to the question that the photograph indexes the real. So it is in a sense not just a picture of the real, it is a part of the real, right? So when we say, why did he take the picture? Why did any of these people take the picture the way they took? We're asking them, why did they become a part of reality in the way that they did? And when we see a colonial photograph, it tells us this is real and this is true. And in fact, it is. It is true, because that is the truth of the colonial gaze. So it's not a fake, it's not untrue, it's not speaking a lie. We have to ask the question to the photograph, what are you saying? With what eye are you looking at this? And we have to ask the same question to each one of you, because by producing even a dream, by writing down your dream and then presenting that as a guide to the way you photograph the people that you photograph, you're not, in a weird way, this is not documentary photography, but it is reality. So a documentary photographer would look at you making that photograph. Okay. Sorry, I took too long to say something.
Sure.
Thank you. Thank you to the entire panel. It was lovely. There were beautiful photographs and a lot to think over. I'm Siddhi. I'm a sociologist by training, and currently I'm a faculty at the Shrishti Manipal Institute of Art, Design and Technology. So just as a sociologist, it's not lost on me that a lot of anthropology was invoked today and anthropological works, and rightly so, because one cannot also help but think of the similarity between photography and anthropology, be it, the time period that they start, or this perception of being intrusive, or relying on the other as data. So my question is actually just related to what you asked, but also taking off on the title of this session, photography as a research method. So as a method, is photography for you guys as practitioners, is it a means to an end, or is it an end in itself? And if it is a means to an end, how do you sort of propose, that end is, not just propose, I'm sure there are multiple ways, but how do you imagine that end is reached as, as a way of providing the audience or even yourself an understanding of a certain people or a place and so on? Yeah.
These are all very difficult questions. Yeah, I think I'm just very tired. No, it's like, but it's like, I think, see, when I entered this realm of working around photography, it's been a very, very recent exposure to me also. And working with the collective, with photographers, for me, like I work on this entire political period of violence in the Darjeeling Hills. So it's largely around memory and trauma and loss and violence of that time, which has been erased otherwise from public spaces. So when I started this research, this work, it was very difficult for me to navigate a lot of complexities also. But working with photographers from the place, it has also allowed me to develop a different kind, like we work with a lot of family archives, family photographs. So working with those photographs through the stories, when we just began with, like, these are difficult questions. How do you revisit these questions again? But when we would just sit with the family members and then we would go through the albums with them over tea or whatever, the kind of stories that come up, or emotions or experiences of those times, that just opened me also as a writer or as a researcher into this field of looking at it in a very different way, of also revisiting these spaces of memories. So for me, I would say that it is not necessarily an end, but it definitely has also pushed me as a researcher, as a writer, to move beyond my own limited faculties also, to explore these spaces and boundaries, what it can offer, how can I navigate these spaces. So I think, yeah, that ways it does have its potential, it does come with its baggages, but there is also space for a lot of conversations and reworking through these spaces. Like I was reading it somewhere yesterday that how do we creatively play around with these silences and fissures that are there in our archives or our spaces, and what do we do with it? Like, how does a future look like forward in rebuilding these spaces? So I think I'm there.
Means to an end. See, for within the Naga context, at least in Nagaland, and when I say Nagas, I mean Nagaland, because there are Nagas in Assam, I mean Manipur, some in, Assam, because Rengmas of Naga Rengmas are in Assam, so Arunachal. I'm not talking about that mainly because I'm from Nagaland. I'm not speaking for the others. I'm just talking within the Nagaland context. I find photographs to be very, very helpful in a way of telling stories, because we, the people, the Nagas, didn't have the tool to tell our own stories for many years, for a long time. Ours is an oral history. We didn't have a written tradition till education came into the place, and so it's been very recent, the history of of Nagaland or the Nagas, and most of those histories are written again by a lot of scholars. So when I started my practice, my work, I took the tool of photography as telling a story. And funnily enough, like Dipti has said, I'm also looking into the archives now to actually look at the past stories of people, to kind of narrate this history of the Nagas that was happening in the intervening years, because when the colonials left and the Indian state came in, for a long time, media was also restricted. We didn't have a lot of stories coming out of that place, and it was very controlled. So to get the story of those times, especially the 50s, 60s, the 70s especially, I'm kind of very interested in looking at the archives, family albums and photographs of people, to tell to tell a narrative, a story that is lost in those periods. So I would say it's just a means. I don't see an end, but if it gives the people the power to tell their own story, then I think that is a good end in itself.
Photography as a research method, and is it an end or a means to an end? It cannot be an end for certain. It's most obvious. So then can it be the means to an end? And in which way can it be means to an end? Within research. For example, the photographs we take, does it come out in isolation? It does not. We are informed by something that the community members tell us, their stories, their history, something that the anthropologist, researcher, or an article that a journalist has written. So there are multiple written scholarship that also informs us, as well as the oral tradition, oral stories that inform us. They come together to help us to take or make a picture. The picture is, hopefully, it tells something. Now let's imagine a set of photographs in our mind, and a researcher, an art historian, an anthropologist who looks at these pictures. What do they find out of it? The very documentary photographs are going to represent the immediate literal reality of how their home was, what tools they had, what kind of utensils, what kind of dress, how they look, and so on and so forth. In works like the approaches that I've taken, the conceptual approach, I don't do the immediate material reality. I'm just twisting the narrative. I'm turning it, trying to tell it in another way. But even within those frames, there are certain material reality that exists. For example, like I was sharing, that I have not introduced any material from the outside world, whatever they had. And it's over the period of time that I've stayed in other people's house, or they've invited me for a cup of tea in the evening, and others have come and joined, and I've heard stories. And I've also looked at their family albums, what they have, what they don't. So those things have also shaped my understanding. But similarly, now let's look at this as a loop. We look at written materials, and that informs us. And our visual materials are now read by historians and scholars and anthropologists, and then they start to draw new narratives or new interpretations of it. That is one aspect. So it's a loop, and this loop needs to be strengthened to take the conversation back to our title, Decolonizing the Image. So we need more scholars and historians who also engage with us, and we learn from them, they learn from us, and it becomes a loop. It becomes much nicer. It becomes a healthier ecosystem for us to do. The strength of a photograph. For a quick short story, I was in this village, and I had a sprain in my right arm, and it was excruciating pain. There were no medicine, but in the village there was a nerve healer. So the villagers took me to the nerve healer, and every year, whenever I would go back, I used to take small photographic prints to give back to the community members. And so they were sifting through that bunch. And suddenly, one of them says, "Hey, how do you know this old woman?" I was like, "I came here in 2016 and I photographed." And they were like, "She is my mother-in-law and she's passed away. After you took the picture, she's passed away and we don't have a single photograph." And they were like, "Can you give me this photograph?" And such photographs now stay within the community, at least as a memory function. And using that photograph, they start telling me stories. I've met the father, a man I photographed in another village, and in another village I'm there. I've been invited for lunch, and they're again seeing through the photograph. And they say, "You photographed my father. This is my father." I was like, "I don't know." And then they start telling certain other stories. So I think photographs have this very nice potential to tell stories, and also to bring out stories and to connect these worlds in a loop.
If I may respond very briefly, because our practice in RUX often works with archival photographs and photographic interventions on archival photographs. And one of the first things we do is to ask the question opposite to the one asked in the life of Pi, which is, what do you see? The question we ask is, what can we not see? In any photograph, there are things that are not visible, or they are barely visible. And I think that like a forensic analyst, you begin to look at what is visible to look for what is not visible. And it's a question of what is within a photograph, also what is between photographs. Because often in an archival data set, you will have several photographs about a particular theme. Maybe they're taken on the same day, maybe they're taken on by the same person or by different people. By trying to see what is between each set of framings, what is not present, you begin to reconstruct or speculate about what might not have been seen, what may have been rendered invisible, or what was opaque, or what was difficult for people to understand. And for me, that's always a task of research, is to ask the question about what can we not see in the photograph. Any other questions? We have 5 more minutes.
Well, actually, it's more a comment. I am Manjulika, also a social scientist, from a health setup, a hospital looking at biomedical research, and being a social scientist. What I found fascinating and really appreciate is the honesty with which you all spoke, and also exposing a vulnerability. The fact that you are struggling with trying to capture what you think is the truth, and the way you've presented that complexity to me was something I admire. Connecting with the means and ends question, as a researcher, the idea of having multiple professionals coming together to use the photographs as the tool to trigger interpretation, the multiplicity, the plurality of interpretation is something I wanted to ask you. In a way, it makes you more vulnerable, but it also strengthens the final understanding. Whether it is final, whether it's complete, again, is a question mark. But just to reflect whether that's something that you feel less about when it's exposed to multiple interpretations, multiple disciplines, dissecting that presentation. Did I get something across? Thank you.
Would any of you like to respond and say a final word? Thank you. I think the question of vulnerability is a very real one. And the practice of photography has moved from being an exercise of power to being an exercise to understanding complicity to being vulnerable. And it switches back and forth between these different positions. And the plurality of interpretations, in my understanding, as Sharbendu said himself, the more people think, write, comment on photographs, use them for their thinking, use them for their research, the greater is the dialogue between photography, reality, and the photographer. And I think this panel itself was a plea for that exercise to find energy, momentum, and a future. So with that, I will end. Thank you very much. You've been an incredible public. And to my panelists, thank you for your contributions and for all the questions. Thanks.
Thank you.